Before we dive into these 3 chilling true crime stories, drop a comment right now telling us where you are watching from and what time it is there. We have people watching this from every corner of the world, and honestly, given what you are about to hear, the middle of the night is probably not the ideal time to be alone with this one. Now let's get into it. On the morning of October the 9th, 2019, a man named Thomas Veller walked up to the guest services desk on Deck 5 of the Meridian Star, a Royal Caribbean vessel currently sailing through the Eastern Caribbean, approximately 200 nautical miles southeast of Puerto Rico, and told the attendant behind the counter that his wife had not come back to their cabin the night before. He was calm. That was the first thing the attendant, a 24-year-old from Croatia named Luka Baric, would remember about him afterward. Not frantic, not breathless, not the way people look when they have spent the night awake and terrified and are finally standing in front of someone who can help them. He was calm in the way of a man who has already decided what story he is going to tell and has told it enough times in his head that it comes out smooth. He said his wife's name was Claire Veller, 29 years old, blonde, 5'6", last seen the previous evening, around 10:30, wearing a white sundress and sandals. He said she had gone to get a drink at the pool bar on Deck 11 while he turned in early. He said he assumed she had stayed out late and come back after he was asleep, and that he had only realized she was gone when he woke at 7 and found her side of the bed untouched. He placed a photograph on the counter. It was a picture of the two of them taken at the embarkation port in Miami 3 days earlier, standing on the gangway in the Florida sun, arms around each other, both smiling. She was beautiful. He looked like a man who knew it. Luka Baric called his supervisor. His supervisor called the ship's security chief. The security chief called the captain. And by 8:15 in the morning, the Meridian Star, carrying 2,942 passengers and a crew of 1,100 on what had been billed as a 7-night Caribbean honeymoon and romance cruise, was conducting a full ship search for a missing woman named Claire Veller while continuing to sail, as scheduled, toward its next port of call in St. Thomas. What none of them knew yet was that Claire Veller was not in the water. She was not on the ship. She was not missing in any of the ways that word usually means when it is spoken on a vessel in the middle of the ocean. She had left the Meridian Star deliberately, carefully, and with a great deal of advanced planning. She had wanted to disappear. She had needed to disappear. And she had used one of the most remote and logistically complicated environments on Earth to do it in a way that she hoped nobody would ever be able to fully explain. This is the story of Claire Veller. And before it is over, you will understand exactly why she did what she did, exactly how she did it, and exactly what one investigator found in 14 seconds of security footage that changed everything about how this case ended. Claire Maureen Veller was born in 1990 in Akron, Ohio, the second of 3 children. Her father was an electrician. Her mother taught 4th grade. By every account from people who knew her growing up, Claire was the kind of person who filled whatever room she was in funny, warm, the one who remembered everyone's birthday and showed up first when someone needed help. She graduated from the University of Akron in 2012 with a degree in graphic design and moved to Columbus, where she worked for a branding agency and built a life that looked, from the outside, like exactly what she had always wanted. She met Thomas Veller at a mutual friend's birthday party in the fall of 2014. He was 31, 6 years older, a financial consultant with a firm in Columbus. He was good-looking, well-dressed, funny in the sharp particular way of someone who is always the most interesting person in a room and knows it. Their friends thought they were perfect together. Their Instagram made people feel vaguely inadequate about their own relationships. They were engaged by Christmas of 2015 and married in September of 2016 inches, a vineyard outside Columbus with 200 guests and a band that played until 2 in the morning. The first time Thomas hit her, they had been married for 4 months. It was February of 2017. They had an argument about something Claire would later describe as genuinely trivial, a miscommunication about plans with friends, the kind of thing that normal couples bicker about and forget by morning. Thomas did not forget it by morning. He grabbed her by the arm in their kitchen, shoved her against the counter, and struck her across the face with an open hand. Then he left the room. He came back 20 minutes later with a glass of wine and an apology that was so articulate, so seemingly genuine, so precisely calibrated to her specific fears and needs, that she almost convinced herself it had been a fluke. Almost. It was not a fluke. Over the next 2.5 years, Claire Veller lived inside a marriage that had 2 entirely separate versions. Version 1 was public, The Instagram posts, the dinner parties, the couple that everyone who knew them described as goals. Version 2 was private, and it was systematic. Thomas did not lose his temper randomly. He did not drink excessively or behave erratically in ways that might have been visible from outside. He was controlled. The incidents were spaced far enough apart that Claire could almost begin to breathe between them, and close enough together that she never fully did. He monitored her phone. He managed her access to their shared finances. He had, over the course of 3 years, gradually and almost imperceptibly thinned the connections between Claire and the people in her life who might have noticed something was wrong. Old friends who stopped getting calls back, family members who found reasons not to visit, colleagues who sensed a distance they couldn't quite explain. By the summer of 2019, Claire Veller was 30 years old, financially dependent on a man she was terrified of, isolated from virtually everyone who had known her before him, and had attempted to leave twice, once in 2018, when she packed a bag while Thomas was traveling for work and drove to her mother's house in Akron, and once in early 2019, when she contacted a domestic violence organization in Columbus through a borrowed laptop at a public library. The first attempt ended when Thomas arrived in Akron 18 hours later, calm and reasonable and devastating in his persuasiveness, and Claire went home. The second attempt ended when Claire found the library's call log on a piece of paper in Thomas's jacket pocket and understood that he had been watching her in ways she hadn't known were possible. She stopped trying to leave through the front door. The cruise had been Thomas's idea. He had booked it in July of 2019, a 7-night Caribbean sailing, as an early celebration of their 3rd wedding anniversary. He presented it as a romantic gesture. Claire accepted it as one, or appeared to. What Thomas did not know, what nobody knew, because Claire had spent months being more careful than she had ever been about anything in her life, was that Claire had already been planning her disappearance for 4 months by the time he handed her the booking. Confirmation, she had help. That was the part that took investigators the longest to piece together, and the part that, once they understood it, reframed every single assumption they had made from the moment Thomas Veller walked up to the guest services desk. Her contact was a woman named Patrice Odom, 43 years old, based in Fort Lauderdale, a former social worker who had spent 12 years at a domestic violence nonprofit before leaving to run what she described, on the minimal online footprint she maintained, as a relocation consultancy for people in crisis situations. In practice, Patrice operated a small, entirely informal network of people who helped women in dangerous domestic situations do what the system had failed to help them do: get out, and stay hidden. She did not advertise. She was found by word of mouth, through whisper networks, through the kind of communication that leaves no trail because it is conducted in person, in borrowed spaces, in fragments. Claire had found her through a woman she had briefly befriended at a yoga class in Columbus in the spring of 2019. A woman named Janet, whose last name Claire never knew, who had noticed something in Claire's watchfulness and her flinching, and the way she checked her phone every few minutes, and had pressed a handwritten phone number into her palm one afternoon in the parking lot without saying anything. That phone number belonged to Patrice. They had met in person exactly once, at a coffee shop in Dayton, that neither of them had any traceable reason to be in August of 2019. Everything after that was conducted through a system of communication Patrice had developed over years, brief, coded, using platforms and devices that left nothing behind. The plan was this. The Meridian Star made 2 port stops in the first 3 days of the sailing, Nassau on day 2 and San Juan on day 3. At the San Juan stop, passengers disembarked for a shore excursion day and were required to return to the ship by 6 in the evening. Claire would not return. She would move through San Juan using a second form of identification that Patrice's network had arranged, not a forged document, but a legally obtained ID in a name that Claire had a distant legal claim to through a family connection Patrice had identified and quietly formalized over several months. From San Juan, she would fly to a connecting city. From there, to a location that only Patrice knew in full. She would contact no one she had previously known. She would not access any financial account connected to her previous life. She would, for all practical purposes, cease to exist as Claire Veller. It was meticulous. It was also terrifying, because the margin for error was 0, and the consequences of Thomas finding out before she was out of reach were something she could not allow herself to think about directly. On October the 6th, 2019, Thomas and Claire Veller boarded the Meridian Star in Miami. Day 1 passed without incident. Day 2, the Nassau stop, passed without incident. Claire went ashore with Thomas, walked through the market district, had lunch at a restaurant on the harbor, smiled at the photographs he took of them, and said nothing. She was counting hours. Day 3 was San Juan. They docked at 7 in the morning. Thomas had booked a private shore excursion, a jeep tour of El Yunque rainforest, a driver and guide, just the two of them. It was scheduled to run from 9 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, returning to the port with enough time to reboard before the 6 o'clock departure. Claire had known about the jeep tour for 2 months. She had known it created a problem. A private tour with Thomas meant she would be with him for 7 hours of the excursion day, which left her approximately 90 minutes between the tour's end and the ship's departure, to create an absence that could not be immediately explained or reversed. 90 minutes was not enough. She had told Patrice this in one of their communications in September. Patrice had said, simply, "You don't need 90 minutes, you need 5. Here is what happened. The jeep tour ended at 4:15, slightly ahead of schedule, and Thomas and Claire were returned to the port area. Thomas wanted to find a bar near the harbor for a drink before reboarding. Claire said she needed to use the restroom. There was a facility inside a small shopping arcade adjacent to the port entrance. Thomas waited outside. Claire went in. She did not come out the other side. She came out a service exit on the building's eastern wall that opened onto a side street, where a woman she had never met, a contact of Patrice's named Rosa, who had been standing at that corner for 40 minutes with a tote bag, handed her a different phone, a different ID, and a printed itinerary, and said one sentence: "Everything is ready." Claire walked to a waiting taxi without looking back. She was at Luis Muñoz Marin International Airport within 25 minutes. Thomas waited outside the shopping arcade for 11 minutes before going in to look for her. By the time he had searched the facility, walked back to the port entrance, and begun to understand that something was wrong, Claire was through security. He did not report her missing in San Juan. He reboarded the ship alone and told no one. He went back to the cabin, sat on the bed, and according to the behavior pattern that would become deeply significant during the subsequent investigation, he waited. He waited through the evening. He waited through the night. He waited until 7 the next morning, when he walked to the guest services desk and reported his wife missing at sea, not missing in port. Missing at sea. That distinction was, in the end, the crack that broke everything open. When the Meridian Star's security team began their investigation, their immediate assumption was that Claire had gone overboard, either accidentally, under the influence, or deliberately. That assumption shaped everything in the first 6 hours. The Coast Guard was notified. A search and rescue operation was initiated in the waters along the ship's route since leaving San Juan. The captain logged the incident as a man overboard situation and followed maritime protocol to the letter. It was the ship's head of security, a former Dutch naval officer named Henrik Voss, who first noticed the anomaly. Reviewing the CCTV footage from the San Juan port stop, which the ship's system captured through deck cameras overlooking the gangway and the immediate dock area, Voss identified footage of Thomas and Claire disembarking that morning at 8:52. He then searched for footage of Claire reboarding in the afternoon. He found Thomas reboarding alone at 5:47. He did not find Claire. This was consistent with an overboard incident occurring after reboarding and before the morning report, but only if Claire had reboarded and then gone overboard in international waters overnight. Voss pulled every angle he had for the reboarding window between 4 and 6 in the afternoon. He reviewed 11 separate camera feeds. Claire Veller did not appear on a single one. She had never reboarded. Voss flagged this to the captain, who flagged it to the FBI, who have jurisdiction over crimes committed on cruise ships in international waters when American citizens are involved. Special Agent Donna Farrell, out of the Miami field office, was assigned to the case on day 2 of the investigation. She flew into St. Thomas, where the ship docked that morning, and boarded the Meridian Star by 10 in the morning. Farrell interviewed Thomas Veller in a small conference room off the main security office on deck 4. He was, she would later write in her case notes, extremely polished. He expressed appropriate distress. He answered questions without hesitation. He had a coherent timeline. He suggested, gently, that Claire had been struggling emotionally in recent months, that she had seemed withdrawn, sad in ways she wouldn't explain, that he had been worried about her. He used the word fragile. He did not overdo it. He placed just enough there to create a narrative framework in which Claire's disappearance could be read as something other than what it was. Farrell noted in her file, subject is either genuinely bereaved or exceptionally prepared, proceeding on the assumption that it is the latter until evidence indicates otherwise. She pulled the San Juan port footage independently, working through the Port Authority's own camera system rather than the ship's. The Port Authority system covered a wider area, including the streets and commercial buildings adjacent to the port entrance. It was in this footage, specifically in 14 seconds of low-resolution video from a camera mounted above the entrance to the shopping arcade on the building's south face, that Farrell found what she was looking for. The footage showed Claire exiting the main entrance of the shopping arcade at 4:29, 3 minutes after she had reportedly gone in to use the restroom. She was alone. She was moving quickly, but not running. She was carrying nothing, no bag, no purse, which was consistent with Thomas's statement that she had left her bag at the outdoor bar table when she went to the restroom. She turned left out of the arcade entrance, walked approximately 15 feet, and turned into a side street. A woman was standing at the entrance to that side street. They exchanged something, a brief handoff, object to object, too small and fast to identify precisely, and then Claire continued walking, and the woman walked in the opposite direction. 14 seconds. That was all Farrell had, but 14 seconds was enough. Claire Veller had left the port voluntarily, on foot, with assistance, in the opposite direction from the ship. She had not been on the Meridian Star when it sailed. She had not gone overboard. She was alive, somewhere, and she had left, on purpose. The question Farrell now had to answer was, why? She requested Thomas's financial records, his phone records, and critically, she contacted the Columbus Police Department and asked whether there had been any calls or reports involving Thomas or Claire Veller at their home address. What came back rerouted the entire investigation. There had been 2 calls to the Columbus Police from the Veller address in the preceding 3 years. The first, in March of 2017, had been logged as a domestic disturbance call, responding officers finding no evidence of a crime. Upon arrival, Thomas had answered the door, composed and cooperative. Claire had appeared in the background and confirmed that everything was fine. The second, in November of 2018, had been a welfare check requested by Claire's mother, who had been unable to reach her daughter for 3 weeks. Officers had spoken to Thomas at the door. He had said Claire was traveling for work. The welfare check was logged as resolved. Neither call had generated a follow-up investigation. Neither had been connected to the other. They sat in the Columbus PD system as 2 separate, closed-out incidents involving the same address, neither of them significant enough to have drawn any sustained attention. Farrell also contacted Claire's mother, Patricia Hartley, in Akron. The call lasted 40 minutes. Patricia Hartley had not heard from her daughter in 8 months. She had not known about the cruise. She began crying approximately 6 minutes into the conversation and did not entirely stop. She told Farrell about the visit in February of 2018, Claire arriving at her door with a bruise that Claire said was from a gym accident, Thomas arriving the following day, and the 2 of them leaving together. She said she had known something was wrong for years and had not known how to reach her daughter around the wall that had gone up. She said if Claire was alive, she needed Farrell to understand that Thomas was the reason Claire had run, and that wherever Claire was, she had not run far enough as long as Thomas was free. Farrell now had the shape of the story. She had the what and the why. What she did not yet have was the where. Thomas Veller, aware that the investigation had shifted its focus in ways he had not anticipated, retained a criminal defense attorney in Miami on day 4 and ceased cooperating with Farrell's interviews. He remained aboard the Meridian Star, which had continued its sailing per itinerary, technically voluntarily, but in practice, because Farrell had made clear, through the ship's legal liaison, that his departure from the vessel before she was finished would be viewed in a particular light. On day 5 of the investigation, Patrice Odom's name surfaced. It came from an unexpected direction. A financial forensics analyst reviewing Thomas's phone records found that in the weeks before the cruise, Thomas had hired a private investigator based in Columbus to conduct surveillance on Claire. The private investigator, in his own records, had noted in a report to Thomas that Claire had made a call from a library payphone, one of the last remaining payphone-adjacent services in Columbus, to a Fort Lauderdale number. The PI had traced the Fort Lauderdale number to a disconnected line that, with some additional digging, the FBI's own analysts connected to a shell address previously associated with Patrice Odom's name. Thomas had known, or suspected, that Claire was planning something. He had known before he booked the cruise. He had booked it anyway. He had taken her on that ship knowing she might try to run, and he had reported her missing at sea, not missing in port. At sea because a woman lost overboard in international waters is a tragedy. A woman who disappears voluntarily in a foreign port is something else. He had tried to control the narrative of her disappearance, the same way he had tried to control everything else. Farrell obtained a warrant for Patrice Odom. She did not arrest her. She went to Fort Lauderdale and sat across from Patrice in a coffee shop and talked to her for 2 hours. And at the end of those 2 hours, she understood what Patrice did, why she did it, and what her options were. Patrice confirmed, without providing a location, that Claire was alive, that she was safe, and that she had left the Meridian Star because her life had been in danger, and the systems designed to protect her had failed to do so repeatedly and consistently over 3 years. Farrell spent 2 days deciding what to do. Then, she called her supervisor. What followed was a negotiation that took place at a level above Farrell's pay grade and involved consultation between the FBI, the Department of Justice, and a domestic violence legal advocate who had been brought in to represent Claire's interests. The core question was this: Claire Veller had not committed a crime by leaving the ship. She had not committed fraud. She had not done anything illegal. She had walked off a boat in a foreign port and gotten into a taxi, which is something any passenger is entirely free to do. The Coast Guard search had been expensive and disruptive, but it had been initiated based on Thomas's false report. Thomas's characterization of her as missing at sea when he knew, or strongly suspected, that she had left in San Juan. Thomas Veller was arrested on November 1st, 2019, 3 weeks after the cruise had ended, at his home in Columbus. He was charged with filing a false report, obstruction of justice, and after a grand jury reviewed the evidence compiled by the Columbus Police Department's Domestic Violence Unit, in coordination with Farrell's federal investigation, 3 counts of domestic battery. The battery charges were based on evidence that included medical records Claire's doctors had retained, photographs found on a cloud backup account linked to a device Claire had left behind, and the testimony of 2 neighbors who had, separately, heard things through shared walls that they had told themselves were not their business. Thomas Veller stood in a Columbus courtroom in March of 2021 and was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 11 years. He will be eligible for parole in 2027. Claire Veller was never located by law enforcement. Patrice Odom was never charged. The FBI closed its inquiry into Claire's whereabouts after determining that she had committed no crime and that her continued anonymity did not obstruct any outstanding legal proceeding. She is, as far as the public record is concerned, a woman who got off a cruise ship in San Juan, Puerto Rico, on the afternoon of October 8, 2019, turned left, and walked into a life that nobody could take from her. Her mother, Patricia Hartley, was contacted by a legal intermediary in the spring of 2020 and informed that her daughter was alive and well and living under circumstances that were safe. Patricia was given a way to send a single written message, which would be delivered through a chain of intermediaries that would leave no traceable connection. She spent 3 days writing it. The intermediary who collected it described it as 4 pages, handwritten, folded into a very small square. Whether Claire received it, what it said, and where she read it are things that are not known. What is known is this: somewhere in the world right now, a woman, who was once Claire Veller, is living a life. She has a different name, possibly a different city, a different country, a different language surrounding her daily existence. She built that life from nothing, with help from a network of people who believed that survival was worth more than a paper trail, starting from the moment she walked out of a shopping arcade in San Juan with nothing but a phone, an ID, and 14 seconds on a security camera that almost nobody would ever see. Thomas Veller reported his wife missing at sea. He was wrong about the sea part. He was wrong about the missing part. But he was right about one thing: she was gone. She had made sure of it. And she had done it in the only way that had ever worked, not by fighting for herself through the systems that had failed her, but by stepping outside of every system entirely, in a white sundress, in the afternoon sun of a Caribbean port city, and simply not coming back. Some disappearances are tragedies. Some are the only act of self-preservation left to a person who has run out of every other option. The difference between those two things is what this case is really about. And it is why, when Donna Farrell closed the file, she did something that investigators are not supposed to do. She sat at her desk for a long time. And then she said out loud, to nobody in particular, in a room by herself, "Good for her." If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with us, the second story in this series is going to hit even harder. A luxury suite, a dead judge, and a French investigator who noticed something that everybody else on that ship walked past. That one is next. On the morning of November the 14th, 2017, a cabin steward named Amadou Diallo was making his way through the private suite corridor on Deck 12 of the Empress of the Mediterranean, a luxury cruise vessel operated by a high-end European line, currently docked in the port of Marseille, France, 4 days into a 14-night sailing that had originated in Barcelona. Amadou had been a cabin steward for 9 years. He had worked this corridor for 3 contracts. He knew its rhythms, the way you know the rhythms of any place you have spent enough time in, the guests who left their do not disturb signs up until noon, the ones who wanted turn-down service at precisely 8, the ones who tipped well, and the ones who did not. He knew the smell of the corridor in the morning, expensive soap, laundered linen, the faint trace of whatever the kitchen had sent up for in-room breakfast orders. On the morning of November the 14th, Deck 12 smelled different. It was subtle. Most people would have walked past it without registering it consciously. Amadou registered it. He stopped outside Suite 1208 and stood there for a moment. He could not have told you precisely what the smell was. He would say later, in the statement he gave to investigators, that it was something underneath the normal smell of the corridor. Something that did not belong. He knocked. He announced himself in the standard way. He waited. No response. The Do Not Disturb sign was not on the door. He knocked again. He used his passkey. Inside Suite 1208, in the king bed in the master sleeping area, propped against 3 pillows, with his hands folded in his lap and his reading glasses still on his face, was the body of the Honorable Gerald Whitmore, 71 years old, retired circuit court judge from Charleston, South Carolina, 12-year veteran of the federal bench, and one of the most well-connected legal figures in the southeastern United States. He had been dead for several hours. Amadou Diallo backed out of the suite, closed the door, and called his supervisor. Within 20 minutes, the ship's doctor, a physician's assistant named Dr. Renata Fisher, had examined the body and reached a preliminary conclusion that was both reasonable and, as it would turn out, almost catastrophically wrong. Gerald Whitmore had a documented history of cardiovascular disease. He was 71 years old. He was found peacefully positioned in bed with no signs of external trauma, disturbance, or struggle. Dr. Fisher logged the cause of death as probable cardiac event and recommended the body be held in the ship's medical facility, pending notification of next of kin and arrangements for repatriation. The ship's captain notified the Port Authority in Marseille as a matter of protocol. The Port Authority sent a form. The form was filed. The Empress of the Mediterranean prepared to continue its sailing on schedule. Gerald Whitmore's daughter, Saoirse, was in Suite 1210, directly next door. She had been traveling with her father for the entire voyage. She was 43 years old, dark-haired, a corporate attorney from Atlanta who had taken 2 weeks off work to accompany her aging father on what she had described to colleagues as a bucket list trip he had been talking about for years. When the ship's security chief, a heavyset German man named Klaus Brandt, knocked on Suite 1210 at 7:40 in the morning to inform her of her father's death, she opened the door in a hotel robe, listened to what Brandt told her, and sat down on the edge of the bed. She cried. She asked the questions a person asks in that situation. She accepted the ship's doctor's preliminary assessment without challenge. She said her father had not seemed well the previous evening, that he had gone to bed early complaining of fatigue, that she had checked on him at around 9 and he had told her he was fine and to let him sleep. She said she was devastated, but not entirely surprised, because his heart had been a source of worry for several years. Her composure was noted by Brandt, who would later describe it as understandable given that she was clearly in shock. Her answers were noted by Brandt as consistent and cooperative. The situation was noted by the ship's administrative team as a sad but not uncommon occurrence on voyages catering to an older clientele. Klaus Brandt wrote up his report, sent it to the captain, and considered the matter largely concluded pending the paperwork. It was at this point that a man named Inspector Henri Lacroix walked onto the ship. Lacroix was 48 years old, a senior investigator with the Police Nationale in Marseille, assigned to the Port Authority's Customs and Financial Crimes Division. He had boarded the Empress of the Mediterranean that morning for a reason that had nothing whatsoever to do with Gerald Whitmore. He was there to speak to a passenger in Suite 1204 regarding an ongoing investigation into the movement of undeclared assets through the Mediterranean cruise circuit, a separate matter, a financial crime case, something involving shell companies and a Belgian businessman that is relevant to this story, only in the sense that it put Lacroix on that ship, in that corridor, at that particular moment. He was walking the length of Deck 12's suite corridor with Klaus Brandt, who was escorting him to Suite 1204. When they passed Suite 1208, the door was slightly ajar. A member of the ship's medical team was inside conducting a final check before the body was moved. Lacroix glanced in as he passed. He stopped. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the room. Then he looked at Brandt and asked, in the French-inflected English that would become a recurring feature of the next several days, what had happened here. Brandt explained. Natural causes. Cardiac event. Elderly American judge. Sad, but not uncommon. Lacroix nodded slowly. He looked at the room again. He looked at the body. Then he looked at the bedside table on the left side of the bed, Gerald Whitmore's side, the side he had died on. And he asked Brandt a question that Brandt would later say he had not known how to answer. He asked why there was no water glass. Brandt didn't understand. Lacroix explained, still quietly, still in the tone of someone asking a casual question rather than making an accusation, that in his experience, and he had been in a great many hotel and cabin rooms over the course of his career, a person who goes to bed in the normal way, particularly an elderly person, particularly one with a heart condition who is presumably on medication, almost always has a glass of water on their bedside table. It is one of the most universal habits of the human nighttime routine. The bedside table on Whitmore's side of the bed held a lamp, an alarm clock, a paperback novel face down with a bookmark in it, and his reading glasses case. No water glass. No medication bottle. Brandt said the room had not yet been disturbed. Nothing had been moved. Lacroix said he understood that. He pointed out that the bedside table on the other side of the bed, the unoccupied side, held a full glass of water, a small decorative vase with a single flower, and a folded card from the ship's hospitality team welcoming the guests to the suite. A full glass of water on the empty side of the bed. No glass at all on the side where a 71-year-old man with cardiovascular disease had spent his last evening. Brandt said perhaps the steward had collected it. Lacroix asked Brandt to please check whether any steward had entered Suite 1208 that morning before Amadou Diallo's discovery of the body. Brandt checked. None had. Lacroix asked Brandt if he would mind very much delaying the removal of the body for a few hours. He then called his supervisor in Marseille and requested that a forensic pathologist be dispatched to the port. What? Followed over the next 72 hours was an investigation that expanded from one quiet question about a missing water glass into something that would eventually involve Interpol, the United States Department of Justice, 3 separate law enforcement agencies across 2 continents, and a financial forensics team whose findings would reveal that the death of Gerald Whitmore on a luxury cruise ship in the port of Marseille was not the beginning of the story. It was the end of one that had been running for almost 15 years. Gerald Whitmore had served on the federal bench in South Carolina from 2001 to 2013. His record was distinguished, his reputation impeccable, his retirement celebrated by the legal community in Charleston with a dinner attended by 200 people. He had been, by every public measure, an exemplary jurist. What the dinner guests did not know, and what had not yet been known by anyone with the authority to act on it, was that Gerald Whitmore had, for approximately a decade, accepted payments in exchange for favorable rulings in civil asset cases moving through his court. The payments had been structured carefully, routed through a series of financial instruments that Gerald had managed with assistance from a financial advisor who had since died of natural causes and taken a great deal of operational knowledge with him. The money investigators would eventually estimate the total at somewhere between $3 and $4 million had been distributed across accounts in 3 jurisdictions, some of it converted into hard assets, some of it placed in a trust that Gerald had established nominally in his daughter's name. Saoirse Whitmore was not a passive beneficiary, she was an attorney. She was, in the assessment of the federal investigators who would later build the case, the person who had designed the financial architecture her father had used to conceal the payments. She had drafted the trust documents, she had identified the offshore accounts, she had managed the flow of money from the point at which it entered the concealment structure onward. She had not been on the bench. She had not taken the payments. She had simply ensured that the money her father received in exchange for corrupting the federal judiciary disappeared into a structure that no one who wasn't specifically looking for it would ever find. For almost 15 years, no one had specifically been looking for it. That changed in the summer of 2017, 5 months before the cruise. A routine IRS audit of a Charleston-based commercial real estate firm, one of the entities whose cases had come before Whitmore's court in the relevant period, flagged a series of outgoing payments that the firm's auditors could not reconcile with any documented business expense. The payments were small individually, irregular in timing, and had been recorded under a category that, on closer inspection, did not match any of the firm's known operational costs. The IRS referred the anomaly to the Department of Justice. A federal investigator named Sandra Oakes was assigned to look at it. Oakes spent 3 months following the payments. The trail was deliberately obscured, but not perfectly, so the financial advisor who had helped Gerald conceal the money had been careful. But he had also been working alone, and without the benefit of anyone checking his work, which meant that the concealment structure, while sophisticated for its time, had gaps that a trained forensic analyst could identify with enough time and the right tools. By October of 2017, Oakes had connected the payments to Gerald Whitmore. By November, she was preparing a grand jury presentation. What Oakes did not know in October of 2017 was that Saoirse Whitmore had discovered the IRS investigation. She had a contact in the firm that had been audited, a former colleague from her Atlanta law practice, who had called her in September, alarmed, after being interviewed by federal agents who had asked questions that Saoirse understood immediately. She had spent 6 weeks deciding what to do. The cruise had been her idea. She had booked it in October. She had told her father it was a gift, something she had wanted to do with him for years, a chance to travel together before his health deteriorated further. Gerald, who had been told nothing about the investigation and whose own awareness of his exposure was limited by the fact that he had always insulated himself from the downstream details of the concealment, had been pleased and touched. He had told his friends it was his daughter's way of showing him how much she loved him. What it actually was the most controlled environment Saoirse could identify for doing what she had decided needed to be done. A ship at sea is a closed system. Medical resources are limited. The physician on board is not a forensic pathologist. The jurisdiction question, which country's law applies to a death in international waters involving American citizens on a European vessel, is genuinely complicated in ways that create delays, and delays create opportunities for evidence to be lost, for bodies to be repatriated before thorough examination, for paperwork to move faster than scrutiny. Saoirse had researched all of this. She was an attorney. Research was what she did. The forensic pathologist, dispatched by the Marseille Police Nationale, arrived at the port at 1:30 in the afternoon on November the 14th. His name was Dr. Philippe Armand. He examined Gerald Whitmore's body for 2 hours in the ship's medical facility, and then sat with Inspector Lacroix in a small room off the facility and told him what he had found. The first finding was that Gerald Whitmore had not died of a simple cardiac event, though his heart had indeed been the mechanism of death. The second finding was that the toxicology screen, conducted with the kind of thoroughness that the ship's initial medical assessment had not extended to, had detected the presence of a substance in Gerald's blood that had no business being there. Specifically, a beta blocker, a class of medication that slows the heart rate at a concentration approximately 4 times higher than would be present in a person taking it as a standard prescription. Gerald Whitmore's medical records, obtained through the ship's registration documentation, which included passenger health disclosures, showed that he was not prescribed a beta blocker. He had never been prescribed one. His cardiovascular medications were a statin and a mild blood thinner, both standard and both present in his blood at normal levels. Someone had given Gerald Whitmore a medication he was not prescribed, in a quantity sufficient to slow his heart to the point of failure, and had done so in a way that was intended to look like the natural death of an elderly man with a pre-existing heart condition. Almost everyone on the ship had accepted that reading without question. Henri Lacroix had looked for a water glass. Saoirse Whitmore was brought in for formal questioning at the Marseille Police Nationale headquarters on the afternoon of November the 15th, the day after the ship docked. She had retained a French attorney within hours of the pathologist's arrival, which told Lacroix something in itself. She was composed throughout the interview. She expressed appropriate grief. She answered questions about her father's health, his medications, the previous evening, with a consistency and detail that suggested either an excellent memory or extensive preparation. Lacroix asked her about the water glass. She said she didn't understand the question. He explained it. She said she had no idea why there was no water glass on her father's bedside table. She suggested the steward might have collected it during an earlier service. Lacroix told her no steward had entered the room. She said she couldn't explain it. He asked her what medications she herself was traveling with. She listed them: anti-anxiety medication, prescribed; allergy tablets, over-the-counter; melatonin. Nothing unusual. He asked if he could examine her luggage. Her attorney objected. A search warrant was obtained from a French magistrate by 7 in the evening. Inside Saoirse Whitmore's luggage, in a toiletry case inside her checked bag, investigators found a prescription pill bottle. The prescription was made out to a name that was not Saoirse Whitmore, for a beta blocker, filled at a pharmacy in Atlanta 6 weeks earlier. The bottle contained 14 pills. The prescription had been for 30. 16 pills were unaccounted for. Saoirse was placed under provisional detention by French authorities on November the 15th. The United States Department of Justice, already building its financial crimes case against her father's estate, was notified of the murder investigation. Sandra Oakes, the federal investigator in Charleston, who had spent 3 months tracing bribery payments through a decade-old financial structure, received a call that reframed her entire case in the space of about 90 seconds. The picture that emerged over the following 6 months of investigation, conducted jointly by French authorities, the FBI, and the DOJ's Public Corruption Unit, was this. Saoirse Whitmore had known about the federal investigation since September of 2017. She had understood, with the clarity of a trained attorney reviewing the evidence, that the investigation would eventually reach her father and, when it did, would reach her. Her father was 71 years old, with a compromised heart. He was, in a clinical assessment of the situation, the weakest point in the structure. Not because he would have deliberately implicated her, she did not believe he would have done that, but because he did not have full knowledge of the concealment architecture she had built, and that partial knowledge, extracted through a federal interview process, creates gaps and inconsistencies that prosecutors use to find the rest. An elderly man, frightened, in front of federal investigators asking questions he couldn't fully answer, would not be able to protect her in the way that silence could. She had decided that silence was the only reliable protection. The crews had given her access, privacy, a controlled medical environment, and a jurisdictional complexity that she had calculated would delay any serious forensic examination of her father's body long enough for the obvious narrative, elderly man, weak heart, natural death, to solidify into the official record. It had almost worked. Dr. Fisher's preliminary assessment had been exactly what Saoirse had anticipated. The ship's security team had been exactly as thorough as she had expected them to be. The body would have been repatriated to Charleston, a death certificate citing cardiac failure would have been filed, and Sandra Oakes would have arrived at her grand jury presentation to find that her primary subject had inconveniently died on vacation in the Mediterranean. Henri Lacroix had looked for a water glass. Saoirse Whitmore was extradited to the United States in April of 2018, after a lengthy legal process involving both French and American jurisdiction, claims that ultimately resolved in favor of the American prosecution, given that the victim, the suspect, and the underlying crimes were all American in origin and character. The French charges, which under their legal system covered the conduct on French territorial waters when the ship was docked in Marseille, were suspended pending the outcome of the American proceedings. Her trial in the court in South Carolina began in January of 2019. It lasted 26 days. The prosecution presented the toxicology findings, the prescription pill bottle, the financial records connecting Saoirse to the bribery concealment structure, the testimony of the Atlanta pharmacist who had filled the beta blocker prescription, and the testimony of 3 former colleagues from Saoirse's law firm who described conversations and behaviors in the weeks before the cruise that they had not understood at the time and understood completely afterward. The defense argued that the pill bottle established only possession, not administration. They argued that the forensic evidence was circumstantial in the specific sense that no one had witnessed Saoirse giving her father anything. They argued that Gerald Whitmore could have obtained the medication himself for undisclosed reasons. They produced a cardiologist who testified that in certain circumstances, a patient might acquire a beta blocker informally to manage symptoms they were embarrassed to discuss with their physician. The jury deliberated for 4 days. On February the 28th, 2019, they returned a verdict of guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and 9 counts of financial fraud related to her management of the bribery concealment structure. Judge Ann Hollister sentenced Saoirse Whitmore to life in prison without the possibility of parole on the murder count, with concurrent 30-year sentences on the conspiracy and fraud counts. During the sentencing hearing, Judge Hollister said something that has stayed with everyone who followed this case. She said that what made this crime particularly difficult to sit with was not its brutality. It was not a brutal crime in the physical sense, but its intimacy. She said that Saoirse Whitmore had sat across from her father at dinner on the evening of November 13, 2017, in a dining room on a ship sailing through the Mediterranean, and had watched him eat and drink and talk and laugh, and then walked him to his suite and said goodnight. She had done this knowing what she had put in his wine. She had done this having already calculated, with the precision of a trained legal mind, the number of hours it would take and the story that would be told afterward. She had said goodnight to her father while he was dying, and she had gone next door and gone to sleep. Judge Hollister said she had been on the bench for 19 years, and she had never sentenced anyone for anything that disturbed her more than that. Saoirse Whitmore is currently incarcerated at a federal facility in Alderson, West Virginia. She has filed 2 appeals, both of which have been denied. She has not made any public statement regarding the case. Gerald Whitmore's victims, the parties whose civil cases had been corrupted by his decade of paid rulings, were identified through the DOJ's ongoing investigation, and a restitution process was opened. Several of those cases were reheard. Several of those outcomes were reversed. The people who had lost money, property, and legal standing because a federal judge had been bought were given, in most cases, something approaching justice, even if it came 15 years late and through the death of the man who had wronged them. The estate Gerald had built, with the bribery payments, the trust, the offshore accounts, the hard assets, was seized as part of the fraud recovery. There was very little left for anyone to inherit. The life Gerald Whitmore had constructed, and the life Saoirse had tried to protect by ending his, turned out to be the same thing. Something built on a foundation that was always going to give way. Henri Lacroix returned to his customs and financial crimes work after giving his formal statement to the Joint Investigation Team. He was cited in the DOJ's case documentation as instrumental to the initiation of the homicide investigation. He received a commendation from the Police Nationale. He has given no interviews. In the one written account of the case that quotes him directly, he is asked what made him stop outside that suite when he was on his way to a completely different interview on a completely different matter. He said he stopped because of the smell, the same smell that Amadou Diallo had noticed and could not quite name. He said in his experience, a room smells different when the person in it is no longer alive, and that this smell is something you either notice or you do not, and that he happened to notice it, and that noticing it made him look more carefully at the room, and that looking more carefully at the room made him see that a bedside table was missing a glass of water. He said, the rest was just logic. The rest was just logic. There is a version of this story in which nobody looks through that doorway, in which the ship's doctor files her preliminary report. The body is moved to the medical facility. The Empress of the Mediterranean continues its sailing, and Gerald Whitmore is repatriated to Charleston in a casket with a death certificate that says cardiac failure. Sandra Oaks presents her grand jury case to find her primary witness unavailable. Saoirse Whitmore attends her father's funeral in a black dress and cries the right amount and flies back to Atlanta and returns to work on Monday. $3 million sits quietly in the accounts she has managed for 15 years, waiting. In that version of this story, nobody is ever caught. Nobody is ever charged. Nobody sits in a federal courtroom and hears a judge say the words she said at sentencing. The victims of Gerald Whitmore's corrupt rulings never get their cases reheard. The money stays hidden. The story stays untold. In that version of this story, Amadou Diallo notices the smell, opens the door, sees an old man in bed, and keeps moving. And Henri Lacroix walks past a slightly open door on his way to interview someone about a financial crime, and his eyes go forward rather than sideways, and he never asks about the water glass. That is how close this one came to disappearing entirely. Not the body, not the crime, the truth. One man looked sideways. And that was enough in this case. Story 3 is the darkest one in this series, and I want to be upfront with you about that before you listen. There is no clever investigator pulling on a thread until everything unravels. There is no single moment where justice arrives and you can exhale, and by the time you finish it you are going to be angry, not the satisfying kind of angry that comes from watching a guilty person get what they deserve. The other kind. The kind that sits in your chest and does not have anywhere to go. Her name was Marisol Aquino. She was 23 years old. She was from a small city called Batangas, on the southwestern coast of Luzon in the Philippines, approximately 100 kilometers south of Manila. She had 2 younger brothers, a mother who worked at a textile factory, and a father who had died of a respiratory illness when Marisol was 16. She had finished her schooling, worked 2 years at a call center in Manila, and in the spring of 2015, had been recruited by a maritime staffing agency operating out of Makati City that placed Filipino workers on international cruise ships. The cruise industry runs in ways that most passengers never think about and the cruise lines prefer not to discuss on the labor of people like Marisol Aquino. Approximately 35% of all cruise ship crew worldwide are Filipino nationals. They work in housekeeping, food service, entertainment, spa services, engine rooms. They sign contracts of 6 to 9 months, live in interior cabins below the passenger decks, work shifts that frequently exceed 10 hours, and send the majority of their earnings home to families in a country where the average wage makes a cruise ship salary transformative. They are, in the structure of the cruise industry, essential and invisible in roughly equal measure. The passengers above them see the result of their labor. They rarely see the people who produce it. Marisol had been placed by the staffing agency on a contract with a major American cruise line. She was assigned as a stateroom attendant, responsible for a section of interior cabins on Deck 7 of a vessel called the Pacific Sovereign, a large contemporary ship running a regular Caribbean circuit out of Miami. She arrived in Miami in June of 2015, boarded the Pacific Sovereign for the first time, and began her first contract. She completed that contract. She came home to Batangas for a 2-month gap, sent money ahead of her, spent 6 weeks with her family, and signed a second contract. She returned to the Pacific Sovereign in February of 2016. She had been promoted during her gap period. Her work evaluations from the first contract had been strong. Her supervisors had requested her by name, and she came back to the ship with a slightly larger cabin section and a small increase in her base pay. Her mother told a journalist 2 years later that Marisol had called home from Miami the night before she reboarded, excited, proud of the promotion, talking about saving enough over the next 2 contracts to put her younger brother through a vocational program. On March the 19th, 2016, 36 days into her second contract, Marisol Aquino was reported missing by her cabin roommate, a fellow stateroom attendant named Gina Salazar, who told the Pacific Sovereign's crew services supervisor that Marisol had not returned to their shared crew cabin after her evening shift ended at 10:30 and had not been seen since. It was 11:45 at night. The ship was at sea, 2 days out of its last port call in Cozumel, Mexico, heading toward its next stop in Grand Cayman. The water outside the hull was the Caribbean Sea. The crew services supervisor, a man named Derek Holt, logged the report and contacted the ship's security office. The security officer on duty that night was a man named Frank Calhoun, 44 years old, a former private security contractor who had been working shipboard security for the cruise line for 6 years. Calhoun reviewed the CCTV footage for the crew corridors on the decks below the passenger areas, identified the last confirmed footage of Marisol at 10:47, walking toward the crew recreation area on Deck 3, and noted that she did not appear on any subsequent footage. He logged a missing crew member report and contacted the ship's staff captain, who was the ranking officer on duty overnight. The staff captain initiated a shipboard search at 12:30 in the morning. The search covered the crew areas, the public decks, the outer deck spaces. It found nothing. At 3 in the morning, the staff captain made the determination that was both the required protocol and the one that would define everything that followed. He concluded that Marisol Aquino had likely gone overboard, notified the United States Coast Guard, and the ship altered course to begin a search of the water in the area it had transited since her last confirmed sighting. The Coast Guard search ran for 14 hours. It covered an area of approximately 200 square miles of open Caribbean water. It found nothing. Marisol Aquino was never found. The official determination, filed with the United States Coast Guard, the FBI's Maritime Jurisdiction Unit, and the cruise line's own incident documentation system, was that she had fallen or jumped from the ship sometime after 10:47 on the night of March the 19th, 2016. The manner of disappearance was listed as undetermined. The investigation was classified as an open missing persons case, and, in the way of missing persons cases involving people who disappear into open ocean with no witnesses and no physical evidence, it was not actively pursued. The cruise line issued a statement of condolence to Marisol's family through the staffing agency in the Philippines. The statement expressed deep sorrow and noted that the company was cooperating fully with authorities. It included information about an assistance fund available to the families of crew members lost at sea. The fund offered a payment equivalent to 6 months of Marisol's salary. Her mother, Celia Aquino, accepted the payment because she had 2 younger children and no other income. She told the journalist who interviewed her 2 years later that she had accepted it because she had no choice, and that accepting it had felt like agreeing that her daughter's life was worth the price of 6 months of cleaning cabins. On a ship, nobody could hold accountable. She said she never believed Marisol jumped. She said that was not her daughter. She said her daughter called home every week and talked about her brother's vocational program and the money she was saving and the islands she was seeing for the first time and the things she wanted to do when her contracts were finished. She said a person with those plans does not jump off a ship in the middle of the night. Nobody who was in a position to investigate disagreed with her out loud. Nobody who was in a position to investigate did very much at all. That, more than anything else, is what this story is about. The Pacific Sovereign continued its Caribbean circuit. The Crew Services Department processed Marisol's departure from the Manifest and assigned her cabin section to a replacement attendant who arrived at the Miami port on the ship's next turnaround day. Frank Calhoun filed his final incident report and returned to his regular duties. Derek Holt, the Crew Services Supervisor who had received Gina Salazar's report on the night of March the 19th, submitted his documentation to the corporate office and did not submit anything further. Gina Salazar, Marisol's cabin roommate, was given a new cabin assignment and a new roommate within 4 days of Marisol's disappearance. She would later tell investigators that she had tried to ask questions in the days that followed and had been told, in terms she described as firm and clear, that the matter was being handled by the appropriate authorities and that crew members were expected to continue their duties and not discuss the incident with passengers. She said she had been told this by Derek Holt personally. She said she had understood it as a warning. She had continued her duties. She had not discussed it with passengers. She had served drinks and cleaned cabins and smiled at the people who handed her towels, and she had not said anything to anyone for 2 years. She was not the only one. Here is what the investigation that eventually came would find. Between 2008 and 2016, an 8-year period, 11 crew members had been reported missing or had disappeared under unexplained circumstances across 4 different vessels operated by the same cruise line. 11 people. The ships were different. The routes were different. The crew populations rotated on contract cycles, which meant that the same individuals were rarely present across multiple incidents. This dispersal, whether by design or coincidence, meant that no single person within the crew community had full visibility of the pattern. Each incident looked, from within the ship where it occurred, like an isolated tragedy. From the outside, with access to the full incident log, the pattern was not subtle. Of the 11 crew members who had disappeared, 9 were from the Philippines or Indonesia. 8 were women. 7 had been working in housekeeping or food service roles, the lower tiers of the crew hierarchy, the roles with the least institutional protection and the most limited access to the ship's formal grievance and reporting infrastructure. The average age was 26. None of the 11 cases had been resolved. None had resulted in a criminal charge. 3 had been closed as probable suicides. 5 had been classified as accidental falls. 2 were listed as open missing persons with no active investigative activity. 1, the earliest case, from 2008, had been closed by the FBI's maritime unit after a 3-week investigation found insufficient evidence to support a criminal referral. The person who first mapped this pattern was not a federal investigator. She was not a journalist. She was a maritime law attorney named Rosalind Cheng, based in Seattle, who had been retained in 2017 by the family of a Filipino crew member named Ana Reyes, who had disappeared from one of the same cruise line's ships in 2014. Rosalind had taken the Reyes case on a contingency basis after reading a brief news item about Ana's disappearance and feeling, as she would later describe it, that something about the company's handling of it was wrong in a way she could not immediately articulate but could not stop thinking about. She spent 8 months on the Reyes case before she found the first indication that Ana's disappearance was not isolated. It came from a database maintained by the International Cruise Victims Association, a nonprofit organization that compiles self-reported data on crimes and disappearances aboard cruise ships data that cruise lines are not legally required to report comprehensively, and that the Coast Guard's own reporting system captures only partially. In that database, Rosalind found 3 other disappearances involving crew members on the same line within a 6-year window. She filed public records requests for the Coast Guard incident reports. She contacted the FBI's maritime unit. She hired a researcher to build a timeline. By the time she had Marisol Aquino's case in her file, alongside Ana Reyes and the others, she had a document that was 43 pages long and documented what she believed was either a catastrophic and sustained failure of crew safety management, a pattern of predatory conduct targeting vulnerable crew members that the company had systematically failed to investigate, or both simultaneously. She went to the FBI with it in the spring of 2018. The FBI's Maritime Jurisdiction Unit assigned Special Agent Thomas Ray to conduct a preliminary assessment. Ray spent 6 weeks reviewing Rosalind's document and the underlying source material. He then spent another 8 weeks conducting interviews. He spoke to former crew members, former security staff, former human resources personnel at the cruise line's Miami corporate office. He spoke to Gina Salazar, who by this point had completed her last contract and returned permanently to the Philippines, and who spoke to him for 3 hours in a video call and said everything she had been told not to say for 2 years. What Gina told Ray, and what several other former crew members corroborated in their own interviews, was this: there was a man on the Pacific Sovereign, and, as it emerged, on 2 of the other ships where disappearances had occurred, whose name came up again and again in the interviews. Not always in the context of the specific disappearances, but always in the context of the environment that surrounded them. His name was Raymond Stokes. He was 51 years old at the time Ray began his investigation. A senior marine operations manager with the cruise line who had spent 22 years with the company and had been promoted 3 times in the preceding decade. He had worked aboard or been posted in an administrative capacity to 4 of the vessels where crew member disappearances had occurred. He had not been present on all of them at the time of the specific incidents. His presence was not a consistent thread in the physical sense. But his name was a consistent thread in the testimonial sense, in the sense that when Ray asked former crew members, without prompting, to describe the working environment in the lower crew tiers, to describe the culture of the ship, to describe who had power and how it was used, Raymond Stokes' name appeared in the answers. He was described how, in terms that were consistent across interviews conducted separately with people who had never spoken to each other, as someone who operated in the specific space between authority and accountability that exists in closed institutional environments, the space where formal power is not quite sufficient to explain the actual power a person holds, where the official hierarchy does not fully describe the real one. Former crew members described a culture of fear around complaints. They described awareness, understood rather than formally communicated, that raising concerns through official channels on a ship where Stokes had influence was not something that ended well for the person raising them. They described incidents that had been reported informally and gone nowhere. They described women being told, in various formulations by various people, to be careful around certain areas of the ship at certain hours. None of this was a criminal case. Ray knew that. Rosalind Cheng knew that. What it was context. And context, in a case built almost entirely on the absence of physical evidence, was the only thing available. The investigation pivoted on a piece of evidence that nobody had looked for, because nobody had known to look for it. In the FBI's review of the cruise line's internal incident documentation system, obtained through a grand jury subpoena that the company's legal team had contested for 4 months before losing Ray's, analysts found something buried in the metadata of a security report filed in connection with Marisol Aquino's disappearance. The report had been submitted by Frank Calhoun on the morning of March 20, 2016, the morning after Marisol was first reported missing. The report in the system was dated and time-stamped correctly, but the metadata showed that the document had been accessed and modified 3 times after its initial filing: once, 4 hours after the original submission, once, 2 days later, and once, 6 weeks later. The modifications were not visible in the document itself. Whoever had made them had used a method that altered the content without changing the visible text specifically, by replacing an earlier version of the document with a revised one that had been saved under the same file name and metadata timestamp. It was the kind of technical manipulation that leaves traces only at the system level, in the logs that record file access and modification history, rather than in the document that a human reader sees. Ray obtained the modification logs. He identified the user accounts that had accessed the file on each of the 3 post-submission occasions. 2 of the accesses were from Frank Calhoun's account. The third was from an account registered to Derek Holt, the crew services supervisor who had received the initial missing person report from Gina Salazar on the night of March the 19th, and who had, according to Gina's testimony, warned her not to discuss the incident. Ray pulled the original unmodified version of Calhoun's report from a backup server archive that the company's IT team had not thought to flag during the document production process. The original version of the report contained 2 paragraphs that did not appear in the final filed version. The first paragraph described an observation Calhoun had made during his initial CCTV review on the night of the disappearance, specifically that the camera covering the crew corridor junction on Deck 3, the last point before Marisol's route to the crew recreation area, had experienced a gap in its recording between 10:51 and 11:04, 13 minutes of footage, gone. The original report noted this gap and flagged it for technical review. The final filed version did not mention it. The second removed paragraph described a conversation Calhoun had with Derek Holt at approximately 1 in the morning on March the 20th, before the full shipboard search had concluded, in which Holt had told Calhoun that the incident should be handled as a probable overboard situation and that the documentation should reflect that characterization. The original report noted that Calhoun had found this instruction premature, given that the search was still ongoing. The final filed version did not include this observation. Frank Calhoun was interviewed by Ray in October of 2018. He had left the cruise line in 2017, was living in Fort Lauderdale, and retained an attorney before the interview. He invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination on most substantive questions. He did confirm, when asked directly, that the original report had been different from the final filed version. He did not explain why it had been changed. His attorney terminated the interview at that point. Derek Holt was still employed by the cruise line when Ray attempted to interview him. The company's legal team provided a statement on Holt's behalf, stating that he had no recollection of the conversation described in the original Calhoun report, and that any characterization of his conduct as improper was categorically denied. He did not speak to Ray directly. But Raymond Stokes, when contacted through the company's legal representation, provided a written statement asserting that he had no direct involvement in any of the disappearances under investigation, that the allegations against him were baseless, and that he was prepared to cooperate fully with any official investigation. He did not provide a direct interview. He did not resign. He continued working for the cruise line in his senior operations role throughout the investigation. The grand jury convened by the Southern District of Florida to review the evidence compiled by Ray and Rosalind Cheng issued its findings in March of 2019. The findings were, in the language of federal grand jury process, a mixed result. The jury returned a true bill, meaning they found sufficient probable cause to proceed on charges against Derek Holt for obstruction of justice and falsification of federal maritime records. They returned a true bill against Frank Calhoun on the same charges, though the government ultimately offered Calhoun a reduced charge in exchange for cooperation. They did not return a true bill against Raymond Stokes. The evidence connecting Stokes to the specific disappearances was, in the jury's assessment, insufficient to support a criminal charge beyond reasonable doubt. Derek Holt was indicted in April of 2019. He pleaded not guilty. His trial in federal court in Miami began in November of 2019 and lasted 11 days. The prosecution presented the metadata evidence. The original Calhoun report, Gina Salazar's testimony delivered via video link from the Philippines, and the testimony of 4 other former crew members who described the culture of the ships and the specific mechanisms by which complaints were suppressed. Holt's defense argued that the document modifications were routine administrative corrections and that the government had constructed a narrative of conspiracy around what were, in reality, unremarkable clerical processes. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On December the 4th, 2019, they convicted Derek Holt on both counts. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and 3 years of supervised release. He was released in 2022. Frank Calhoun received a sentence of 18 months in exchange for his cooperation, which included a full account of the conversation with Holt on the morning of March the 20th, 2016, and confirmation that the camera gap on Deck 3 had been identified during his original review and had been deliberately omitted from the final report at Holt's instruction. He served 14 months. Raymond Stokes was never charged. He retired from the cruise line in 2020 with a full pension and what the company described in an internal communication, later obtained through a civil discovery process, as a distinguished record of service. He lives in Clearwater, Florida. He has made no public statement. The cruise line paid settlements to the families of several crew members whose disappearances fell within the period covered by the investigation. The settlements were structured with non-disclosure provisions. The amounts were not publicly disclosed. Marisol Aquino's mother, Celia, was among the families who received a settlement. Her attorney, working in coordination with Rosalind Cheng's legal team, negotiated a figure significantly higher than the 6-month salary payment the company had offered in 2016. Celia accepted it. She put her younger son through the vocational program Marisol had been saving for. He graduated in 2021. His mother attended the ceremony. She brought a photograph of Marisol. Marisol Aquino was never found. The determination of undetermined manner of disappearance on her Coast Guard file has never been amended. Nobody has ever been charged in connection with her death, or with the deaths of the other crew members, whose disappearances fell within the pattern Rosalind Cheng mapped. The camera gap on Deck 3 of the Pacific Sovereign, the 13 minutes that Frank Calhoun identified on the night of March the 19th, 2016, and that Derek Holt told him to leave out of the report, was never explained. The footage, if it ever existed in recoverable form, is gone. Rosalind Cheng continues to practice maritime law in Seattle. She has taken 7 additional cases involving crew member disappearances on cruise ships since 2018. She told a reporter in 2022 that the system has not meaningfully changed. She said that the structural conditions that made it possible to disappear 11 people across 8 years without triggering a serious investigation are still largely in place. She said the dispersal of the workforce across ships and contracts, the jurisdictional complexity of maritime law, the financial and reputational incentives that cruise lines have to manage incidents internally rather than expose them to external scrutiny, and the specific vulnerability of workers who are far from home and operating under contracts that can be terminated without appeal, all of it is still there. She said the Holt conviction was a real outcome, and she was glad for it, and it was nowhere near enough. She is right. It is nowhere near enough. Here's the thing about this story that I cannot stop thinking about, and that I think you will not be able to stop thinking about either. Marisol Aquino called home every week. She talked to her mother about her brother's vocational program and the islands she was seeing and the plans she had. She was a 23-year-old woman doing hard, unglamorous work in a floating city in the middle of the Caribbean, sending money home to a family that needed it, building something. She was not a passenger. She was not on vacation. She was at work. She was in her workplace. And the workplace that was responsible for her safety managed her disappearance from the moment it happened as a document control problem. They changed a report. They removed 2 paragraphs. They told a frightened young woman who had been her roommate not to talk about it. They processed her out of the crew manifest and assigned her cabin section to someone new. They offered her mother 6 months of salary and hoped it would be enough. And for 2 years, it was. For 2 years, the only person who kept looking was a lawyer in Seattle who had taken a case on contingency because something felt wrong. The passengers on the Pacific Sovereign during the week of March the 19th, 2016, never knew any of this happened. They had their dinners and their excursions and their towel animals and their poolside cocktails. The ship sailed on. The ocean received whatever it received on that night and kept it. The corridor on Deck 3 went back to smelling like laundry and institutional soap and whatever the kitchen had sent up. And somewhere, in a house in Batangas, Philippines, a mother who worked at a textile factory to support her family had a framed photograph of her daughter on a shelf, and she still picks it up sometimes. And the picture shows a 23-year-old woman in a white uniform standing on the deck of a ship in Caribbean sunlight, smiling at whoever was holding the camera. That is where this series ends. Pay attention to the people who do the work that makes the world run. Pay attention to where they are and who is watching out for them. Because when nobody is watching, and the institution in charge of them decides that management is cheaper than accountability, what happens in the dark stays in the dark. Unless someone keeps looking. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video. And if you have someone in your life who works in a system where their safety depends entirely on the people above them having their best interests at heart, tell them you are paying attention. It matters more than you know.